So we all recall the Sanjay Gupta, Joe Rogan podcast interview, and we've seen a lot of breakdowns, including the one that we did just the other day, on some of the details with this particular interview. But there's more to the story here, and there's even a deeper way of looking at this that is actually extremely meaningful and you probably haven't heard before. Joining me here is a media expert, Richard Garner, host of a Third Way podcast, and we're going to break down what Richard has identified as one really key, or actually probably a few key takeaways from this exchange, this good faith conversation between Joe Rogan and Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Welcome, Richard. What do you got, in a breakdown of what you saw happen during that discussion?
Wow, Joe, imagine that, a good faith conversation. the unicorn of 2021. Well, let's focus on, first of all, the headlines that people were aware of and what I would say is the glass half full, okay? Some super significant, important, let's call them validations of things that you've been discussing for months and others have, that have been either marginalized, dismissed, or censored, ends up being things that somebody of the pedigree of Sanjay Gupta, who, Joe, people forget, was tapped by Barack Obama to be the Surgeon General, not just a TV doctor, and who turned that down, if I remember correctly, to continue to practice medicine. But the fact that he was able to have an entirely reasonable conversation about his concerns with Tony Fauci and the gain-of-function research and the Wuhan and the COVID origin story, the lab leak theory.
Did you read the email leaks, the emails from Peter Daszak and all the different discussions that they had about their concerns that they were responsible for this through gain-of-function research?
They applied for a grant to specifically to insert a furin cleavage site, which is that particular part of the virus that raised so much concern. Yeah, I mean, look, the thing is, this gets back to the same thing I think we're dancing around a little bit, which is I don't know sometimes what to do with this. It's highly suspicious. I think of this sometimes the way I think about my teenage kids. They're not telling me everything here. Now, do I automatically assume they're totally guilty of everything I think they're guilty of, or is there something else going on here? And there was a letter that came out from Peter Daszak in February of last year that he wrote in The Lancet, along with a bunch of other people, saying this thing, this is ridiculous to suggest that this had somehow been bioengineered at a lab.
Meanwhile, the internal emails suggested that he had very different concerns.
That's worrisome. And I said that to Peter, this is not making sense.
And what did he say?
He said, hey, there's no evidence that the virus ever existed in this lab. There's no evidence that it leaked out of the lab.
Well, that's because they destroyed a lot of evidence.
This is concerning.
They deleted how much evidence did they delete in 2019? Some stunning amount.
Well, the entire database went down.
Exactly.
Now, I said I said to him, you were part of the WHO investigation. Did you see the database now? It's been over a year later. He said no. When I said, is that not of concern to you? He said, look, he goes, it was a public database. They were worried about hacking, and so that's why they took it down. I said, if it was a public database, why were they worried about hacking? What were they trying to hide? So I don't know, Joe, what to make of it. There's clearly, as you said earlier, I think you said where there is smoke, there is fire, probably. But can I say conclusively? No. And part of me thinks we may never know.
So we can see there, it's clear that he's questioning it, right? As everybody should have, right? That's kind of the feeling that I'm getting from that.
Well, I don't think there's any question that if you put a bunch of people of his pedigree in a room together without recording devices or cameras or anything, you're going to get 100% consensus. Imagine more scientific consensus around the fact that it's obvious that this is the source. People might go back and forth as to the role the NIH played, whatever, but I think we'll get beyond that at some point when the temperature cools down. Mm-hmm. What was interesting to me, though, beyond that, was that he was willing to acknowledge, and I don't agree with people that, he was drag kicking and screaming to acknowledge that CNN was wrong to claim that Joe Rogan took horse dewormer. I think this is a smart guy. He showed up there knowing he was going to be asked that question. Mm-hmm. I think he did his best to be able to provide some shelter for CNN and make the point that there is a version of ivermectin that is X and whatever. But in the end, when Rogan ultimately pushed him to say, do you believe I took, like I can afford people medicine, I think, as he said,
yeah.
and that it was prescribed by my doctor, that CNN definitely knew that, and they still chose to use a headline saying that I took a horse dewormer, that they lied. And Gupta said they shouldn't have said that. So that, again, that's a monumental, significant piece of validation for people out there to help with the gaslighting that's going on when people are like, is it me? Am I crazy? Now, of course, the one thing that CNN's Don Lemon wanted to talk about after this massively viral newsmaker of an interview between Gupta and Rogan was, of course, well, wait a sec, we got to talk about that thing where he kind of implied CNN lied. And unbelievably, as you'll hear in this clip, he doesn't, of course, address the headline. The question here is, did CNN know definitively that Joe Rogan did not take a horse dewormer? And we all know, because Joe Rogan literally did an Instagram video saying he was prescribed the medicine by his doctor. So it's an impossibility that they didn't know that.
Right.
And yet they claimed that he took horse dewormer, knowing full well that they could conflate those two and make it seem like that. But was Lemon willing to acknowledge, okay, yeah, maybe we misstepped there? No, he wanted to double down. And even when Gupta, I think, wanted to sort of, correct the record there, he gets interrupted. But I would argue that Gupta should have pushed harder here. But as we'll see, Don Lemon not willing to let it go.
He did say something about ivermectin that I think wasn't actually correct about CNN and lying, okay? Ivermectin is a drug that is commonly used as a horse dewormer. So it is not a lie to say that the drug is used as a horse dewormer. I think that's important, and it is not approved for COVID. Correct?
That's right. That's correct. It is not approved for COVID, and you're right. I mean, the FDA even put out a statement saying, basically reminding people, it was a strange sort of message from the FDA, but that said, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, stop taking this stuff, is essentially what they said, referring to ivermectin. Now, I think what Joe's point
that
is...
It has been approved for humans, but not necessarily for COVID, right? Yeah.
That's correct. It's been used for a parasitic disease, for something it's called river blindness, and it's been very effective for that. But, just because it works for one thing doesn't mean it works for something else.
Right. So we can see there that Gupta is almost a little bit uncomfortable with how much Lemon is trying to stick to this story. And what I found fascinating watching this was just the idea that, like you mentioned, Gupta's almost trying to correct the record a bit there, but Lemon's pushing, and it's almost like, what does CNN expect now? There's going to be even less trust in their institution because they don't want to come out and admit when they've made a mistake. So, what else are they going to lie about into the future?
Well, I think when the time comes and we look back historically at what preceded Sanjay Gupta leaving CNN, I think the Rogan interview will obviously be one of the sort of signposts on that. But this Don Lemon interview might be looked at as one of the straws that broke the camel's back. Because Sanjay Gupta has been at CNN for, a couple of decades, I'm guessing. And, he's an incredibly well-respected doctor, personality, health expert across the board. I think he's enjoyed the level of, let's say, validation from working with a brand like CNN that you could argue at one time was recognized as a trusted news source. That they both benefited from that relationship. But as we both know, that has changed dramatically over the last 5 years and certainly exponentially in the last couple of years and the last 18 months. I think somebody who's always prided himself on his dedication to the Hippocratic Oath, to being a doctor for the people, being somebody who listens to everyone, who doesn't like to be seen as superior, talking down to those dumb people who don't get it. This is a guy who's always been pretty compassionate, pretty humble relative to his position. And even of all the rarities, Joe, that we talked about unicorns earlier, well, here's another, maybe a two-horned unicorn. Somebody who came out with a strong position, who then followed up later by saying, you know what, I was wrong. I didn't do enough research into what I initially was talking about, and I wanted to know more about it, and I did. And of course, we're talking about his position on cannabis. He had come out against it like everybody else in his field. Then he started to look into it, and then famously came across these stories of epileptics, especially pediatric epileptics, who had gone from 300 seizures to 0 with some treatment from some CBD, THC combo, whatever it was, and then did a documentary essentially supporting the medicinal marijuana potential that is out there. You could search all day, Joe, and not find somebody that has done such a dramatic pivot with his personal and professional pedigree on the line, and didn't care because he cared about getting it right. It paints a picture of a complex guy, a guy who wants to acknowledge how little we do know, and wants to learn more about the things that he doesn't necessarily understand from his own life experience or his own career. Now, does that sound to you, Joe, like a guy that would be comfortable working at CNN in the year 2021? I don't think so, because he has now woken up and found himself in the Fox News of the left. Mm-hmm. And he's a guy that would be repelled by, the absolutism, the obvious misinformation, manipulation, the lying. Let's not mince words. Yeah. CNN has adopted at some point, I don't know when, prior to Zucker, after Zucker, prior to Trump, during Trump, prior to COVID, who knows exactly when, but they made a choice internally. We are going to do whatever we can, regardless of whether it ends up being manipulation, lying, not reporting things, ruining people, censoring, whatever it is, because we've decided that the end justifies the means. And the end for us at CNN is Trump, or anybody like Trump, never gets elected again in this country. And then he finds himself watching his network, probably on a regular basis, with Fauci and everybody else coming on saying, we definitively know this, we definitively know that. And I believe personally that over the last X amount of time, Sanjay Gupta has made the decision, this is not where I want to be. This is not where I should be. And right now, he finds himself in a real dilemma, because I can guarantee you he watches 70% of the things on the network and shakes his head and thinks, how am my brand is associated with this. But I wouldn't be surprised to hear that Sanjay Gupta leaves CNN, mutual parting of ways, at some point in the next 18 months, and he starts the process of becoming his own person, his own brand, his own media channel, so that he can control the content and do what he wants to do more than anything, which is be able to talk credibly about health.
So, yeah, I mean, I feel what you're saying here, and knowing and having looked into so much of what goes on with journalists and talking with journalists that oftentimes get stuck at mainstream media outlets and so on and so forth, and how much control that can happen there. My thoughts would be, if what you're saying and in your assessment, it turns out to be true and is true, it almost would feel like in some way, shape, or form, Sanjay's been sort of operating as a bit of a lackey for, 5 years, 6 years, could be even as much as 10 years with CNN, pushing pharmaceutical points, continuing on with this, with the oftentimes agendas that we see Big Pharma push through their media partners. It would essentially mean that he's probably felt this way for a long time, if what you're saying is true. And now it's hitting a breaking point.
I think you just touched on a key point that, to be honest, I hadn't thought about. I had never thought about that, actually. That might be one of the biggest concerns. Well, at least to your point about that he's felt some degree of discomfort for a period of time. Maybe, again, prior to COVID, prior to Trump, the relationship with the pharmaceutical industry that you cited has got to put you in a bit of a dilemma as to your ethics as somebody who wants to be seen as an objective purveyor of health information. If you're looking at Joe Rogan, which again, let's not forget, he cited that he listens to Rogan all the time. Mm-hmm. He would even bring up past guests, past episodes. Well, is there a degree of envy? And I don't say that again maliciously. I mean, if you're somebody with the pedigree and the profile of a Sanjay Gupta, how could you help but watch this person every day and think, man, that's what I want to be doing. I want to have no holds barred. I don't want to be censored as to what I can, or I don't want to be self-censoring. And I'm always going to do that with a corporately owned legacy media network. And here I could be going out and being true to myself and to my patients.
Yeah, I recall back to that. I remember when I first watched that Lemon interview with Sanjay and the follow-up there, just looking at Sanjay's face and getting a feel on what he felt and whatever there. There was something there that very much alludes to this conversation, which is that, maybe he's having of sorts this sort of awakening of how broken, if you will, so much of mainstream media is, how it's dividing the masses, it's not providing a valuable service as it thinks it is, and perhaps he's seeing the writing on the wall that this old way of doing news and media is falling apart, and he's wanting to jump ship. And for people that might be critical, as we're talking and as I'm even listening to you, I'm almost feeling some people watching this going like, no, Sanjay's a terrible guy, he's a bought and paid for lackey, la-di-da-di-da. I can almost sense that some people might feel that. Sure. And I just want to allude to the idea that everybody, if even the media we're doing, which is let's help the world grow and evolve and change and create a better world. And if we believe that that's possible, then we might even see these shifts in people that we currently despise, if you will. The Sanjay Guptas of the world who we think are just pushing along pharmaceutical narratives, maybe they hit a breaking point. And I feel like that's what you're suggesting here, is this could be a moment for him to sort of grow and evolve beyond something that he knows is broken and perhaps model a more ethical, balanced, open, honest discussion for the general public.
I couldn't have said it better myself, and that's the most important takeaway of this conversation, is that we all have to leave that space for, like, what are we even doing trying to bring information to people if we don't want to give them the space to potentially have a difference of opinion, or to reframe what they might have thought, or to start in one place and maybe end up in another place. Isn't that what we're saying we want people to be able to do?
Yeah.
We want people to be able to be introspective and ask themselves real tough questions objectively and be willing to shift opinions. If not, then we're just digging a deeper hole on this whole intractable, I'm this and I'm that, and that can't be changed. I don't care what you say. Anybody who is in that camp, who is incapable of that, are of no value to moving things forward. Full stop. If you believe Gupta was a bought and paid for shill entirely, well, then you would still have to acknowledge the courage it would take to then go on Joe Rogan's podcast. Because you could argue that's a career-ending moment for him if he wants to stay in that world.
Yeah.
He will forever be tainted in certain places because he, quote unquote, validated Joe Rogan. Regardless of who we think Sanjay Gupta is, and I'm not by any stretch saying Sanjay Gupta is 100% this or 100% that I 100% like him or I 100% don't. All I'm saying is that the guy has shown a pattern throughout his career to do things that most people in his position would not and could not do. And this is just another extension of that, arguably the most dramatic, especially considering the times we're in.
Well said. And I think, this lens even too of, just the idea of how much CNN might be, or might have been molding him into a certain character as an actor on the show and the network, and him maybe even just not feeling comfortable with that level of inauthenticity anymore. So, which you've alluded to. So, it's fascinating, and I guess time will tell. In terms of what decision he makes and what happens. I think we're seeing an evolution in media, and I think it's an exciting time, although a trying time. But appreciate your breakdown and your unique insight into this. I had not thought about it in the way you did, so it's always nice to hear different perspectives. Thanks so much for coming on.
Great stuff. Thanks, Joe.